Okay, welcome back. I'm Kellye Mantooth. I'm an MRI technologist, MRSO, and MRSC, a current board member for the ABMRS, and also Metrosen's National MR Safety Trainer.
And I'm Toby Gilk, also ABMRS certified MRSO and MRSE, current board member, former chair of ABMRS, and 2 times former member of the ACR's MRI Safety Committee. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, so the last episode we talked a little bit about recent adverse events. If you've not watched that, this would be a great time to go back and watch that, because now we're going to talk about how did we get here, what do we do, and where are we going, where do we think we can improve?
Yeah, my personal opinion is that we've done a disservice to MR techs. I mean, as an industry, for the last 30 plus years, as MRI risks have increased, right? You know, we went from 1.5 to 3.0 and now 7.0. Yes, that's still ivory tower research institution magnets, but they're out there, right? Fast spin echo, super powerful gradients and super fast slew rates. Almost every technological innovation in MR has come with some incremental little risk, and every time it comes with a risk, we essentially turn to the tech and we say, "You guys can handle that, right? You're good with, that's a small additional risk, right? Oh, by the way, we're going to cut reimbursement and we're going to try and squeeze through twice as many patients in any given time frame. You're okay with that, right? Oh, salary costs are going, out of control. We're going to want you to work on your own, until the second tech shows up, 3 hours into your shift or whatever. You're okay with that, right? We've got a new, referring physician group of neurologists who are implanting God knows what weird stuff, new active implanted devices that have MR conditional lists that are as long as your arm that you have to clear. And oh, by the way, they do a horrible job actually documenting the specifics of the implant or device. You're okay with that, right? If we look at sort of the growth of risk in MR, over the last 30 plus years, almost every single one of the incremental little risks that we add on, the distractions, the demands for some sort of multitasking, all of that stuff we've essentially laid at the foot of the technologist. It has been unfair for some period of time, but I think that what we're seeing now, in my opinion, is not just it being more unfair. What I think we're seeing is the breaking point of technologists. That we've continued to, load on task after task after task. We've cut the resources, we've, pushed greater throughput, and I think people are breaking. And I think that that's fundamentally behind what we're seeing in terms of, the first half of this year, the explosion in MRI accident anecdotes and photos, that some of which we shared in the last episode. What do you think, Kellye?
I agree, and I think too, if you start thinking about kind of like when you're driving, if you were driving your car down the road and the phone rings, maybe you can handle, maybe not holding your phone, but like a phone conversation. But then, oh, it's raining. Well, now you've got to turn your windshield wiper on. But oh, your back window just blew out. It's one of those things where your attention span can only be given to so much. And so when we start divvying that up to, oh, hey, you've got to answer the phone, and here's an implant for your next patient that needs to be looked up. And by the way, maintenance is in the department. They need supervision to change this light bulb. How many things can you truly focus on at one time to say that you're given 100% to MR safety?
And I think the great resignation, or the people being done working in healthcare, and we've seen the want ads, for MR techs growing and growing and growing. And even if you are fortunate enough to be at a facility where you have enough MR techs to fully fill your shift, if some of those techs are agency techs, right? They're folks who really aren't familiar with your local policies and procedures, or your standard ways of doing things, or why we do Dr. Smith's patients differently than we do Dr. Jones's patients. And all of that stuff, all of that sort of institutional accumulated knowledge doesn't live in the head of your agency techs or your PRNs. So that means that the staff techs, in addition to doing their job, they're constantly, looking over their shoulder to make sure that the agency techs aren't screwing something up badly, right? So even if you're fully staffed, but your staff is, at least partially agency folks, you're not fully functionally staffed because, again, to your point, the division of attention. You can only multitask so much before you can't, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and even thinking about what you just said about agency travel techs, even I think a layer deeper than that, when we start thinking about, if we've got all these new techs and we're in a really, really strange time in MRI where you've got techs that have been doing this for, maybe 30 years and they lived through a point in time where, oh, you have a pacemaker? No, you can't have an MRI. Oh, you have this? No, you can't have an MRI. And now we're in a time where we've got new techs, new grad techs who just said, yeah, I sat for a board and I passed it and I don't have any experience other than that, but I know how to scan and that's sufficient. Let's put them in a seat because we need warm bodies, right? And so you've got these new techs that maybe don't have the knowledge to know, like, what is a good question to ask about what's safe or what's not safe, or they don't, or maybe they do have some knowledge and they think, oh, we scan everything. And so it's just easy to say, yeah, we can do that, and just to think about the spectrum of who is where and how do we get everybody to be on the same place when it comes to MR safety and have the same practices when it comes to MR safety. If you think about a department that maybe has 20 people, I bet it would be safe to say, like, we've got some people that their knowledge on MR safety is very minimal, and some people their knowledge is a lot. And I think along that spectrum too, you'll have people that will vary, that will say yes to things, and others will say no to.
Yes, and that's not exclusive to techs. In my experience, I've seen the same thing in radiology groups.
Yeah.
I was working with one hospital facility that brought me in to help them strengthen their policies and procedures and practices. And I was sitting with one of the overnight techs. I always feel like if you want to get the sense of how strong or weak a facility is, you want to sit with the weekend or the overnight, or weekend overnight if they have them, shifts, and just sort of see how that works, right? And so I'm sitting with this tech, and I must have observed, 3, 4, 5 hours overnight, something like that. And they had a screen that showed the work list and they're doing their inpatients overnight. So a lot of these may be patients who just need the MR study before discharge, right? So you don't clear those patients on that work list. Those are additional patient days, and they get pushed till tomorrow night or the night after that, right?
Yeah.
So I'm watching the board, and it seems like for every 2 patients this tech scans, 3 more names pop up on the board, right? And I'm looking at this and I'm going, man, do you ever get through your work list, your overnight work list with inpatients? He said something to the effect of, yeah, every 10 days, 2 weeks, we'll actually, end the shift with an empty, work list. I said, it never stops. And he said, no, it never does.
No, it doesn't.
I was like, and at this particular site, the overnights inpatient, if the patient didn't need monitoring, the tech was alone, and I said, well, how do you take a break, in a situation like this? And he said, oh, that's easy. The inpatients all have some, poorly documented implant or device. You said all you need to do, because the radiology group assigns its most junior members to do weekend overnights, right? Low man on the totem pole gets the least wanted shift. All you need to do is pick up the phone and call the radiologist on call and say, I just need you to clear this patient. They've got a poorly identified biliary stent, and I'm not comfortable scanning this patient without radiologist approval, right? And the tech knew.
Put it on hold for day shift.
Exactly. So the tech absolutely knew that the overnight rads would push it to the daytime rads who they believed were more comfortable doing these clearances. And it almost didn't matter how simple or how complex the concern was on behalf of the MR tech. Patient would get canceled, and of course, in the overnights, everybody's scheduled because you're waking up the patients and bringing them down. Voila. You got a 45-minute meal break in the middle of your shift. Because so if we can game the system, if we can play the radiologists, right? The only reason we can do that is because, just like you were describing with the techs, even within the radiologists, there's a huge variation in terms of their level of knowledge and comfort with this. And I think one of the problems that we face is there's no real standardized expectation of MRI safety training or knowledge. That's true for MR techs. That's true for radiologists. Yeah. So it's almost like spin the roulette wheel, and pick a number, 1 to 100. What percentage of MR safety knowledge do you actually, have in your head, right? And then we're going to do the same thing again, once for the tech, once for the radiologist, or if we have 20 techs or, 10 radiologists in this group or whatever, and you're just sort of spinning and randomly getting a grouping or a distribution of the knowledge, and it's all over the place.
There is no standardization.
If we want to provide uniform patient care, which includes sort of uniform treatment of risk assessment and safety related issues, the safety piece has got to be a part of it.
Yeah, I agree. I do think residents now, are they required to start, are they testing residents on MR safety now?
So there's ACGME, Academic Council of Graduate Medical Education, something. ACGME, they're the folks who set the residency training minimum requirements for all of the medical specialties in the United States. And they have the graduate GME requirements for radiology, diagnostic radiology residency program as well. They require in their minimum training that residents are trained on the physics of MR with respect to image generation, but they're not required to be taught about MRI safety. Now, ACGME has this, they call them milestones, and those are recommended, essentially, training elements. It's not part of the minimum requirement, but it is a recommended element, and they do have this recommended element for MRI safety and risk assessment. And while it's very simply described, it's actually fairly useful in terms of describing, in my opinion, sort of the information that residents really should be taught. Now, it doesn't break it down and say, this is what you need to be taught about static fields, or this is what you need to be taught about radio frequency related heating. So it's not as structured and paint by numbers as I would like for it to be. Hopefully next time ACGME updates their minimum requirements, hopefully some of what is now sort of their recommendations for MRI safety training move into requirements. The board exams for board certified radiology slowly expanding MRI safety questions. So moving in the right direction, but there's
Hopefully.
a long way to go from,
A long way to
from
go.
where we are
Yeah.
to where I think we ought to be.
Yeah. And so then when we think about accrediting bodies, right, we only know of one that even requires an MRSO. Is that correct?
Right.
And the
Yes.
rest, the rest don't require an MRMD. Is that correct?
No, they don't. So there's a lot of confusion with ACR because obviously the ACR has the MR Safety Committee and they have the manual on MR safety, and the manual describes the MRMD, MRSO, MRSE roles and says, everybody should do this. But then there's the ACR's MR accreditation program, which is, you would think they both share the name ACR. They're both work product of the same organization. They're going to share a lot of common elements. They don't. The minimum requirements, site accreditation requirements for ACR's MR accreditation program, you don't need an MRMD, you don't need an MRSO, you don't need an MRSE. The ACR does require somebody called a modality supervising physician. So you need to have a physician, presumably a radiologist, who is responsible for the MR modality broadly. That doesn't mean that they have to be the point person for MR safety related questions. Doesn't mean they have to act as the MRMD. Doesn't mean they even have to appoint somebody else to act as the MRMD. You can go through the whole ACR MR accreditation process, and even though it says it in the manual, you don't have to do it for accreditation.
That's interesting. Interesting that there wouldn't be some sort of correlation between the two. Given that this is what we're saying are the best practices, why wouldn't we follow those to ensure that you're accredited?
There is like one sort of backdoor mention of the safety standards in the accreditation requirements for the ACR. And again, this ties back to the modality supervising physician. And it essentially says that radiologist is responsible for making sure that the manual on MR safe practices or MR safety is followed. Which is strange because, at least at most hospitals, the radiology group is a contracted, third-party group. They're not employees of the hospital. They're not actually in the org chart of the radiology department, other than, over there somewhere is where the radiology group is. And yet, we're saying that this one person in the radiology group is supposed to make sure that the hospital hires and fires appropriately and trains appropriately and staffs appropriately and budgets for MR conditional equipment appropriately, and all of these things that really are not in the direct control of the radiology group or the head radiologist. But that person is supposed to be responsible to the accrediting organization for making sure that the hospital does all the stuff it's supposed to do. Which never made any sense to me as to how that's supposed to work.
Yeah. I don't know either. I think that would be I don't want to say a burden, but think about how would you carry all of that, knowing that like you're just a contract worker and here these are my suggestions or the things that I would like to see happen, but I'm not a direct employee of you. It's interesting. I'd love to see somebody lay that out a little bit better. Yeah.
Because, when it comes time to renegotiating, contracts with the radiology group, right? Well, these guys were a real pain in the butt. They kept on coming over onto my side of the fence trying to tell me how to run my business, right? I want these guys out of here. There's no mechanism that I see that actually makes the folks who control the magnet, who control the staffing of the magnet, to actually do the things that those people really need to do to build safe practices.
Yeah. So do you think moving forward, if we talk about where can we go, how do we get out of this, what do we think the evolution of a safer MR environment will look like? Do you have a picture in your head? Is there something that you can look at and say, okay, well, if we did these things, it would improve?
Yeah, I would love to tell you that I've figured out some sort of silver bullet, the one thing we need to do and it fixes everything, like the diet commercials, right? All you need to do is drink these protein shakes 4 meals a day. I don't think that there is a one-size-fits-all, single solution. I'm glad that we were just talking about MRMD, MRSO, and MRSE. One of the challenges with, and this is going to take the conversation sort of full circle to where we started, one of the challenges with, the idea that MR safety is the technologist's responsibility and nobody else's, it's impractical to actually build a structure, with only the technologist being responsible. That mythology, right? MR techs have been gaslit. MR techs, if you ask them who is responsible for MR safety, most MR techs that I know will say, I am the person responsible for safety, right? And I absolutely applaud the individual investment in doing their job well and protecting their patients. But I hate to break it to you, you are not the person responsible, right?
Right.
We don't have the person responsible in sort of the default way that we set this up. We need the person who is responsible. Actually, we need the people who are responsible, named individuals. But it can't just be, the tech and whichever tech is on duty. So we need dedicated MRMDs. We need somebody on the physician side who is, the point of contact, the authority from a clinical, risk-benefit standpoint, in terms of defining practices for the group, for the hospital. We need an MRSO. We need an individual whose job is essentially quality control over the deployment of standards and practices at the point of care. It's not to say that they can't also scan sometimes. I'm not saying that every facility, even single magnet, rural hospitals need to have, one FTE that is their MRSO and does nothing else. But look at what we do on the radiation safety side, right? If you have a nukes program in your hospital, you have a radioactive materials license, you are required by law to have a named radiation safety officer. You're required by law to have quarterly radiation safety meetings. You're required by law to have physician representation participation in your radiation safety quarterly meetings. All of these things, you have to document what you're doing. You have to have QA/QC structures in place specifically for safety, right? On the MR side of it,
What is that?
we need the individuals, the MRMD, MRSO, MRSE, and we need the structures. And we don't have to reinvent the wheel. We've been doing it for the last 50 years on the ionizing side. Let's just take a page from their book. Let's do what they are doing. I think the single biggest beneficial change that I think that we could see would be individuals in the roles and structures in terms of holding accountable the organizations, making sure that the resources that are necessary to building competence, to helping raise the floor. We may feel like we don't need to send everybody and their brother to, you know, become MRSOs.
Right.
And that's okay for where we are now. I personally believe that the MRSO training is really something that every MR tech should be exposed to. But what we need to do is we need to say, you know what, this is the minimum level of knowledge. And I'm not talking the 10-minute narrated PowerPoint CBL that you sit your techs down in front of, you know,
Right.
once a year for them to check off and answer the quiz at the end, the retention quiz, which everybody on staff knows the answer sequence is CBADF, you know. What, don't make me watch the thing. Just give me the quiz and I'll, you know, because I've memorized the sequence of the answers, right? Mm-hmm. That is not how we need to be training these people, right?
Yeah.
We need to make sure that we're, again, you know, sort of raising the floor. Mm-hmm. And that doesn't mean jettisoning people who received inadequate training in whatever training program or experience they had before. It means every hospital, every imaging center needs to do a better job about making education and training available, not only to the techs, but to the RADs as well. We need to raise the floor. We need to make the lowest acceptable level of MRI safety knowledge higher than it is today. Because right now, there is no floor. There is no bottom to this well in a lot of facilities.
Yeah, I agree. And what do you think about administration? What do you think their part is in a safer MR environment?
Well, I think we need to recognize that, you know, in healthcare today, you know, we're dealing with a resource-limited environment. So I totally get that administration, you know, doesn't want to write a blank check, you know, in terms of, go do whatever you need to. I'm sure we'll find it somewhere in the budget. But you can't also bury your head in the sand and say, you know, well, we didn't have a bad thing happen last quarter or last year, so, you know, therefore stopping the next bad thing from happening really isn't a priority, right?
Yeah.
Two very big problems with that kind of mindset. The first off is you probably don't know, as an administrator, what bad things have been happening in MR.
Yeah.
I can't tell you the number of times that I've gone to administrators having heard about, you know, a problem at a site, you know, only for them to say, well, that never happened here. Well, how do you know? Well, because if it had happened here, I would have been told. You know, it's like, well, I was told. I don't work there. So maybe there's a problem in terms of communicating these problems, you know, internally within the structure. So that's problem number one. You may not actually be aware of what the real risk environment is that you're working within, right? Yeah. And problem number two, the idea that because it didn't happen last quarter, last year, you know, is somehow proof that, you know, you're safe, you're running a tip-top, you know, operation. MRI accidents, the image that we showed in our last talk about the bed in the bore of the magnet, right? And we talked a little bit about some of the contributing causes for that, that the site essentially wanted the ICU nurses to have access into the controlled access part of the MRI suite. So they said, you're level 2 now, right? Now, I don't know that they weren't actually given the level 2 appropriate training. But we can come up with all of these sort of administrative or bureaucratic workarounds to MRI safety policy. Well, let's just make it easier if we leave the door unlocked, right? If we ignore the ferromagnetic detector, all of these sort of things. Those really bad accidents don't happen because one thing is broken. They happen because 2 or 3 or 6 things are broken. And it's only when those 6 things are broken in the same moment, you know, that the terrible thing occurs. Yeah. So if your rationale for ignoring MRI safety is that bad thing didn't happen last year, right? That doesn't mean that you're practicing safely. You may have all 6 things that are necessary for the horrible thing to occur. You may have all 6 things wrong at your site, but they haven't all been wrong at the same instant that you've got a patient right there, right?
Yeah.
And if you don't look, if you don't ask the questions, how do we measure up against best practices? Not check boxes, but actual best practices. If you don't ask those questions, you can live in a fantasy land state of delusion where you think everything is fine until it's not.
Until it's not.
And you don't want to get caught in that situation.
Yeah. I think this goes back to a little bit about what we were talking about earlier regarding an MRMD working in conjunction with a hospital site. It's one of those scenarios where if you've got these experts on staff, consult with them, see if everybody can get on the same page and we can come up with something that feels safe to everybody. Not just like, oh, well, this is my hospital and this is the way I'm going to run it and this is not what the MRMD wants, or we don't need the MRMD's contract work, or, it takes a team, it takes a village of people, and it's going to take all of those people working together to say, let's get this right.
It does, and that's in part because we've got so many different interests that we're kind of beholden to, right? Yes, we need to satisfy state for licensure or joint commission or whoever for accreditation, right? But we also have to recognize the financial realities of this, and so we have to, answer to, whoever is responsible for the budget, and we have to work within the environment that may be really short-staffed. We may have a really tight availability of qualified techs.
Yeah.
Any one person who thinks that they've got the answer to everybody's problem is deluding themselves. We need a team. You need to have, the representation and investment from people who come at this with different perspectives. The doctor or the MRMD is going to, be looking specifically at maximizing accessibility and risk-benefit analysis. The MRSO is going to be looking at this in terms of how do I operationalize this. The radiology administrator is going to be looking at, are there efficiencies that can be gained from changing these structures, and how do I make this work financially, and what equipment do we need to add to what we've got, and how do I work that in with the budget cycle. If you have, the one person who's wearing multiple crowns, and is making decisions for everybody, they're probably making pretty bad decisions for a lot of other folks.
Yeah.
Maybe they're making great decisions for themselves, but, not everybody else.
Right, I agree. All right. Well, is there anything else in your magic ball that you can pull out that you think would make MR safety better in the future?
Related to a bunch of the accidents we looked at in our last conversation, I would suggest, and I don't want to say this in a way that gets anybody into trouble or sets anybody up for failure, I would suggest we need to get better at saying no. Or at least, no right now, I can deal with that later. I think that the divided attention that has become sort of the standard working mode for MR techs, I think that we need to, and administration needs to be able to say, too many things. Too many things going on concurrently. You have permission to say, I can't do that right now, and still deliver the appropriate level of care to the patient who's on the table right now, or who's screening for him I'm trying to go through, or implant or device I'm trying to do lookup.
Right.
Whatever is important to delivering appropriate and safe care to this patient right now, we need to guard that. And if that means, tell Dr. Jones, I'm sorry, I can't take his call right now, I can call him back in 20 minutes. And that's the best I can do right now. give yourself permission to say no or not right now, and recognize how fragmented our work has become and how dangerous that is to us and to our patients. And reclaim some of that. Reclaim your attention, reclaim your focus. And that may require, collaborating with administration and supervisors. But that may be, in the near term, something that we can all do to, just try and make sure that some of the accidents that we've been looking at are much less likely to happen, where we live.
Yeah, I agree. I think for me, when I think of the evolution of a safe MRI department, what do I think that looks like? We see so many of these more, I don't want to call them progressive, but we see a lot of facilities that have MRSO teams, and their whole job is to clear implants or to help with scheduling or protocols. Or, you have some facilities that have one MRSO that just oversees safety for the whole site. They're not a scanning technologist. Their job is totally just to oversee safety, or tech aides, or, just additional personnel to help take off some of this workload off of the technologists that, like you said, we just keep piling it on. We just keep saying, hey, I know you've got this patient on the table, but there's a doctor on the phone, and here's an implant for your next patient. And like I said earlier, maintenance is in here, and, the phone's ringing, or whatever is going on, but just additional personnel to help bear some of that weight, to say like, hey, let's divvy some of this up, and let's put all of our attention into this one thing that we think that we can do to keep our patients safe, and if that means you're the scanning technologist, you're the scanning technologist. Your focus is that patient for whatever the duration of that exam is.
I agree. Yeah. I also think that we would probably be a whole lot more efficient. Swiss Army knives are handy, but if you want something that cuts really well, you probably don't actually want a Swiss Army knife, or you want, a screwdriver. Yeah, the one that you fold out your little red Swiss Army knife is probably not the best screwdriver, right?
Right.
So what you're describing is get the right tool for the job, and stop depending on Swiss Army knives, the all things to all jobs, MR tech. That everybody has, by necessity, sort of been, had to become. And we probably can't strip everybody back to just a single task in many instances. But yeah, getting rid of some of the distractions and being more efficient about, putting people in the jobs with the tasks that they're going to bring the most value to patient care and the most value to the organization. That makes a whole lot of sense to me.
I agree. Toby, it's been really fun getting to chat with you about this. I hope all of our listeners have enjoyed it as well, and we hope that you're having a good MR Safety Week.
Indeed. Yeah. Happy MR Safety Week to everyone. Do you say Happy MR Safety Week? Is that the right way to do that?
We might have to revisit that. I don't know.
Yeah. We'll have to call up Hallmark and ask them, when you make the cards for your, MR Safety Week, what exactly is the greeting?
Well, we hope it's been informative. We hope people have learned a lot, and that hopefully this will help change some things and make your facility safer.
Indeed. Kellye, thank you so much.
Thank you, Toby.
All right. Take care.
Bye.